NATO member states sought to put together a show of solidarity as tensions came to a head at the alliance's 70th anniversary meeting in London. But voices of division were raised on several issues in the UK capital, and the American president left early after feeling insulted. So how will its member states find agreement on divisive issues? How does NATO see itself 70 years after being established and 30 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union? And what are alliance members saying about China this year around? To discuss these issues and more, I'm happy to be joined in the studio by Cui Hongjian, Director of the Department for European Studies at the China Institute of International Studies, and Mark Pinner, China Practice Managing Director of Interrail Consulting. We'll also speak via satellite with Richard Weiss, security expert at the Wikistrack Global Consultancy in Washington, and Professor Juve Toker from the American Graduate School in Paris. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Ray. So Mark and Jen, what are the major issues on the agenda for leaders of member states of the NATO when they were celebrating NATO's 70th anniversary of NATO in London?
Well, I think one of the big issues that's been on the agenda is what is NATO's mission. You know, that's clearly Macron, President Macron wants to redefine this. You know, he wants to have a new mission where NATO focuses more on terrorism, issues in Africa, and is less focused, say, on the military threat from Russia.
Hongjian.
Yes, I think at this time, mostly it's a kind of a celebration, as we know, because very, I mean, for NATO, very critical time now, especially after 70 years. Even not today, I mean, just, you know, as early as the end of the Cold War. Still, I mean, keep a long time, NATO is trying to find the reason of survival as a collective military organization. But of course, I think recently, because I find that a very huge change between the Europe, countries and the United States, especially very big change of the American policy towards Europe. So I think it is some unrest indeed among some member states, especially from the European side. But of course, I think now we can find some maybe result from this meeting is, firstly, NATO try to maybe not only redefine from President Macron and also from NATO itself. It's try to redefine itself, just like Secretary General Mr. Stoltenberg mentioned that, okay, now we need to transfer from a military organization to a political and military organization. But it's not the first time in the history. I still remember several years ago, NATO did the same thing, try to change this NATO as a military organization. Another issue is how could NATO get some consensus among all of the member states, especially what's a major threat to most, not all, maybe most of the member states. I think so far, not yet. I mean, finish this task.
Let me cross over to our French guest speaker who's standing by in Paris, Professor Juve Toker. Hello. Do you believe...
Hello, Beijing.
Do you believe the NATO identity and its prospects need to be redefined clearly in the 21st century? First of all, by the transatlantic relationship, and second, about who is our enemy. Because it is who is the enemy that defined, for example, the semi-alliance relationship between Washington and Beijing at the height of the Cold War during the Reagan administration, which even sold some arms to the People's Republic of China to combat a former arch-rival, the former Soviet Union. Do you think there are some points in what I said in generating our definition about the future of NATO?
Yes, it is indeed an interesting and relevant staging of the question you have dealt with our colleagues in the studio in Beijing and going forward. I mean, the definition of what NATO is about and who is facing NATO in terms of who is the adversary, who is the enemy, who is the one or several in front of NATO, according to which the military policy and the political staging should be defined, is actually not a new question. It has sort of new urgency through the events that we have followed over the last few months. But actually, it's about 30 years now since the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 that this kind of substantial question is in the air. Every now and then there's an effort, a sincere effort to tackle it on the part of European partners, on the other side of the Atlantic. This time it was President Macron of France who, in a way, in a very public and one could say provocative way, just brought the issue on the agenda, brought it up to the surface just 2 weeks before the 70th anniversary of the organization, which took place this week, and said, come on, this organization is brain dead. Something radical should be done about exactly the question you put to me a minute ago, namely, who is the adversary we should calibrate our efforts against, and which way should we collectively, the NATO members, think about it? Now, this does not have an answer, but at least one could say that those 48 hours of summit in London, which had, of course, a ceremonial aspect and the 70th anniversary through the fact that the leaders were gathering together and trying to get good faith.
Did you feel that there was actually a face-off between your President Macron and President Donald Trump over the issue of brain death? Because your president is quoted as saying he would still stand by his words, like brain death of NATO 30 years after the Berlin Wall fell.
Yes, I think President Macron actually did it publicly as well as privately, insisting on the fact that he does believe not only in the content of what he said in such a provocative way 15 days ago, roughly in an interview to the British Economist, but also that he insists on thinking the very same way through the summit and after the summit. Having said that, he had obtained some elements which actually go in this direction. First of all, he had, in a certain way, seems to me, sort of waken up, at least on the public sphere, many of his partners, including, surprisingly, the American president, Donald Trump.
Thank you very much. I'll get back to you, Joe. I'll get back to you in a few minutes. But Mark, do you think President Macron was talking to the domestic audience, or was he talking to other member states of the NATO on the issue of brain death?
I think he's talking about both. I mean, it's a metaphor, right? So he's a metaphor for trying to say we need to have change. Perhaps he's trying to sort of he's demonstrating him to being a leader for France, but he wants to, in part, you know, he also wants to build a European army, right? He has an agenda to do this. So this maybe he sees the threats. He wants to see a NATO that will also allow the creation of a European army. So you can say that, but I think that is NATO really brain dead? I think it's not dead in that sense. I think for its members it's extremely relevant. So
one critical article in the Treaty of the Alliance, NATO alliance, is Article 5. One for all and all for one. Do you think this still exists ever since the Iraq War, when former President Jacques Chirac and Gerhard Schröder, former Chancellor of Germany, disagreed openly with President Bush on the invasion of Iraq, particularly over the issue of Article 5? Do you think today, in the case of Syria, particularly the future of the Kurds, the two sides across the Atlantic Ocean see eye to eye on this? What are your thoughts?
As we know now, the Article 5 for the treaty for the NATO, now it becomes a co-issue or co-item for all of the member states. Even you mentioned the Iraq War, yeah, indeed, there was a big gap between the European members and the United States, because as we understand, they do have a different strategic vision. For most of the European countries, they prefer have some more market, have some more benefits economically. But of course, for the United States, indeed, very different strategic vision, especially globally. So we can find some even debates in the history between the European members and the United States on this so-called different strategic vision. But recent years, I think, it changed the content of the debate changed a lot, because just like you mentioned, the principle of Article 5 is one for all for one. But now the question is, yes, all for one. The one is the United States, America first. But how about the one for all? No. Now, I think from European member states, especially why...
So is that an idea of a one country, two systems?
Yes. So now why President Macron got a lot of anger about these behaviors by Mr. Trump? Because also, the direct reason for that is, the situation in Syria. United States, Turkey, and the Kurdish. So what happened? So even there was not any coordination in the frame of NATO. So that's the reason why President mentioned, okay, you just from you, American, first interest. How about the interest of European members? Also, once there are huge changes in the security situation in North Africa and the Middle East, European countries will get a lot of suffering directly, not the United States. So I think now it will give a very, very big question mark to this so-called co-issue for Article 5.
Yes, and the President Macron also urges member states to give a redefinition about terrorism in Syria, about the future of Kurds. So do you think this is a catch-22 security dilemma for most member states of NATO, particularly those in continental Europe?
It's difficult, but I think many would welcome more of an attention on terrorism. So many of the NATO member states, whether they can agree a combined definition is unclear, because I think they would not find unanimity on, they would find it difficult to find unanimity, and the issue of the Kurds are one in particular, because I think not all of them would want to label the Kurds and the Kurdish party that the Turks are having a conflict with as terrorists. But so I think that would be difficult.
The asylum-seeking tsunami events a couple of years back may have divided the spectrum of NATO leaders on the war-torn country of Syria. Having said this, let's look at the symbolic presence of Russian military in Syria. Let me go back to Jove Toker. Professor Toker, is it true that Russia remains the biggest threat, other than the additional mention of China this time around, the first time that China surfaced as a serious adversary, so to speak? Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg was one small step short of saying China would be a public enemy. He would only say China has surfaced as a new challenge, but its rise also brings about global implications of opportunities. So what do you think of the implications of China's rise, its global impact for NATO militarily? We are so far apart geographically, and yet do you think European allies have actually come under fire or pressure from Washington that they should join the maritime patrol in the South China Sea, for example? What do you think of this issue?
No, indeed, that's the very first time China is being referred to in this way, indeed as a challenge, not as an enemy, neither as an adversary, but as a challenge in the context, the larger context of this reflection effort which the NATO members should do, according to the final communique, according to many of the other points heard during the summit. No, I don't think that there could be a comparison between the overall attitude of NATO members towards China as a challenge and the long experience, tormented set of relations with the Russians. Not only because of the geographical proximity, Russia is in part, in an important part, a European partner, a European protagonist. And there are concrete situations, mainly, of course, the one in Ukraine, in which there is a clear conflict, including a military conflict on European soil regarding regions of Ukraine. That's just next door. That's an hour-and-a-half plane from where I'm sitting here in Paris. Of course, nothing to compare with the way the NATO members appreciate China. But don't forget that in terms of trade, commerce, some military maneuvers, Chinese influence and presence in Africa, which is just across the Mediterranean. If you look at it this way, then the proximity of the preoccupation regarding what our real Chinese ambitions are, what kind of means and to what extent is Beijing ready and willing to invest in those means, and to what extent may in the future, near future, or not so
Professor
near future, be becoming adversary.
Your mention of Africa reminds me of a concept, turf battles. Is it true that China is quietly fighting for turfs in Africa? But President Xi Jinping delivered a policy speech in Cairo a couple of years back, saying China neither sought to fight a proxy war or seeks to have our own turfs in any parts of the world. And yet NATO is so afraid of having China descending on their security stakes in the African continent. Do you think this is ridiculous, or do you think there is some truth, some ring of truth in their concerns?
I think this time, for the first time, but even in official, unofficial way, it's last year, NATO tried to raise China's issue or as a concern for NATO. I think now the question is, yes, just like we always mentioned, the NATO tried to find out more reason for survival. So maybe now the rising, especially China's rise, become maybe one of the target. But so far, I think that now the question is, if we find out there's a document from NATO, maybe three major concerns about China. Firstly, how about the capability, military capability of China? Especially the Secretary General mentioned that, okay, now China has a very, very good
hypersonic gliders.
Yes.
That can cover
it can,
Europe and the United States.
Yes. And secondly, how about the 5G issue? Because China now in advance in this in this field. And the third is how about this critical infrastructure investment? Also, recently, especially China has a lot of the investment in Europe. So there's three major concerns. I think so far, now NATO try to keep a balance, how to define China as a, I think firstly it's try to reflect this definition from Washington to Beijing. Just like the United States mentioned, okay, China and Russia now, both of them are the strategic rival. But for the NATO, not yet rival, but it's try to find between rival, challenge, and maybe a partner of dialogue. If we look at this, the three categories of this, instrument to deal with some threats last year, I mean, from annual report from last year of NATO, the triad is 3D. The D is, the first is dialogue, and then defensive, and the third is deterrence. So I think now, roughly, NATO tried to define China as between the dialogue and the defensive, because which means that, okay, we try to find out more opportunities, especially for European countries, to get some more cooperation with China economically. But at the same time, we need to maybe give some, red line or deadline for Chinese investment in European countries. So I think now still not yet a very stable or a certain definition about China.
Thank you very much. Let me cross over to Richard White, who's standing by in Washington. Richard, we got off to a very interesting start in the discussion about how to redefine the identity of NATO as well as its prospects in the context of the transatlantic relationship. Now, we're talking about whether China is a threat and what's the relationship between NATO and China in the 21st century. Do you think it's more because of Washington's threat and urging that European leaders grudgingly came to accept China as a security challenge? Or do you think Europeans themselves started to realize that China, with its global economic expansion, is fastly descending on their security stakes in places such as Africa? How do you explain and clarify why European leaders said in their joint statement that China is a threat, a challenge?
Right. I think in this case it's generally being driven by both factors. The Trump administration has adopted a more negative view of Chinese foreign policy than previous U.S. administrations, and it's tried to push the Europeans to accept that, most notably in the 5G area. But in addition, the Europeans themselves have been moving in a somewhat harder line. Of course, it varies by country and issue. But, and in addition, China is becoming a much more prominent player in many of the issues that are of concern to Europe, the Arctic, Africa, telecommunications, space, cyber, and so on. But as the previous guest rightly pointed out, it's not only seen as a threat/challenge or so on. There's also seen as possible opportunities. NATO and China had a dialogue for a while about collaborating in Afghanistan. That made some progress, but not a lot. I mean, at the time, it was difficult to get over the legacy of the Kosovo bombing. But I think now it's a good time to reopen the dialogue and talk about more these issues more generally. And NATO is quite comfortable doing that. It does that with Russia, having a combination of dialogue and defense.
At the press conference, journalists asked almost the same question as to S-400, the air defense system that Turkey imported from Russia, which is obviously incompatible with the defense system of NATO. Turkey remains a very important member of NATO at this moment. So what do you think of finding a solution to this dilemma? Richard?
This is a challenge. As your viewers probably remember, the Turks originally wanted to buy a Chinese air defense system, and the U.S. and other countries lobbied them against that, and so they reopened the bidding. And the last time they chose a Russian system, the S-400, and I think many people here underestimated the tenacity of that decision. We thought, well, if they reverse the earlier Chinese decision, you heard the same kind of arguments about the importance of NATO interoperability and so on, you could dissuade them in this case as well. And that has not occurred, and it's worrisome because even at the cost of losing access to the F-35 program and having strained relations with NATO, the current Turkish government's willing to stick to its guns on Syria, on the S-400, and so on. And in addition, there are other countries that are sort of borderline. The U.S. sanctioned China for purchasing the S-400, but it's now faced the prospect of sanctioning India and many other countries, which it really doesn't want to do. It was hoping to frighten them off from buying the system.
Thank you very much, Richard. Mark, both the U.S. and Russia have quit the INF Treaty this year, which exposes continental Europe to Russian missiles. What does the end of the INF Treaty mean for NATO? Do you expect a renewed arms race?
Well, certainly Europe wants to avoid that. I mean, one of the biggest things that Europe remembers from the Cold War is potentially being a nuclear battleground between different parts of the world. So I think they really want to avoid this. I think, though, that France, the UK are still powers with nuclear weapons, and I think they remaining with that deterrent. I don't think that they will be thinking that there is a need for a new nuclear arms race. They will be comfortable with their ultimate deterrent, and I think they wish to retain NATO in particular because they are concerned about potential military threat from Russia. Right? Russia has spent a lot of money on developing its military, and has potential has the theoretical potential to do a lot of damage there.
Hong Jian, the spokesperson of the Chinese Foreign Ministry, said over and over that China would not be involved in this latest initiative of being involved in the nuclear disarmament process. Why do you think China takes this position?
As we know, one of the open reasons for the United States to defend its behavior to withdraw from INF is they need to take China into this maybe new negotiation. But of course, even some European countries echoed with this kind of proposal from the United States. But I think the Chinese stance as clear as possible. Firstly, China has its commitment and also promise to take use of the nuclear weapon. And so far, it's a very different, degree, especially if you take a look at these arsenals for these nuclear weapons between the United States, Russia, and China. So indeed, even some European countries like France and maybe UK, they will be involved into this so-called new negotiation for INF or some other, disarmament treaty. But I don't think it's a case of China, because China always thinks that comparing with some other nuclear weapon countries, China, not only on the size and also the weighting and also the target, it's very different. So I think that's the reason why China has its very clear stand on this issue.
Previously, the Munich Security Conference would only have European leaders and leaders of the United States, heads of state. As this time around, on the occasion of the 70th anniversary of NATO, China emerged as a security challenge. Is it necessary for the Chinese government to take a second look at the opportunity or necessity that we should send a high-profile delegation and clarify the Chinese position on security issues concerning the future relationship between European Union, NATO, and China this time around?
Certainly. I think now it's another very important time for China to, not only review its military capability or how China is willing or how China is willing to provide more public goods in security issue. Because now, indeed, China did something, especially in Asia and the Pacific region, but not enough. I think not only China will be more active in some dialogue like a Munich Security Conference, and also China should express its willing why China will invest a lot in United Nations, especially peacekeeping. Because China did a lot, to support peacekeeping in the frame of the UN. But how could it find out the logic, especially to give the explanation to the international security community that China becomes stronger, and China spend a lot, more and more in military expenditure, but it will be more, there will be more contributions to the stability and also these certainties in the regional and also global level. Thank
you very much. My last question goes to Professor Joe Toka, who's standing by in Paris. What do you think are is it necessary for China to send a delegation to the Munich Security Conference, since we are fast becoming a global player and NATO has good reasons to fear that we could be a challenge for their future? Very quickly.
Well, from a Chinese point of view, if you look at it, if you try to analyze it on a planetary scale, yes, the answer is yes. It would be in China's interest, seems to me, to be present in forums such as Munich. What I would add just before the end of this discussion is that perhaps the most bizarre and important element we haven't mentioned yet in the discussion is what is happening in Washington, namely the policies, or the ambiguity rather of policies, coming from the White House, which have influenced in such a dramatic way, an important way, the way everybody thinks, the Chinese, the French, the British, the Turks, and Russians, and everybody else. And this will have an answer on that about a year from now, as the Americans are.
Thank you very much, Professor Toka. Perhaps China should do more to be involved in the post-war reconstruction in Syria and help somehow stem the flow of refugees from this turbulent and volatile part of the Middle East. Thank you, everybody, for being with us. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.